The invisible ceiling. How female millionaires master high-stakes decision-making and logic. Introduction. The myth-busting provocation. Society expects emotional volatility, but the world's wealthiest women are playing a much colder game. Behind every nine-figure empire is a calculated refusal to let feelings dictate the bottom line. Today, we are dismantling the invisible ceiling by revealing the precise, debiased logic used to master high-stakes decision-making. Welcome. Take a breath and settle in, because what you are about to hear is not a motivational pep talk. This is a masterclass, a surgical dissection of the cognitive architecture that separates high-net-worth women from everyone else in the room. I want you to picture a boardroom. 12 people sit around a gleaming table. The stakes are in the hundreds of millions. The room crackles with tension, ego, and fear. And at the head of that table sits a woman. She is not the loudest voice. She is not performing confidence. She is thinking precisely, strategically, coldly. And when she speaks, the room shifts. How does she do it? What separates her mind from the noise? That is exactly what this audiobook is about. My name does not matter as much as what I am about to share with you. What matters is this. Over years of studying the decision-making patterns of women who have built empires, from tech founders to private equity chiefs, from real estate moguls to media powerhouses, I have found a pattern, a repeating, undeniable signature of logic that the most successful women in the world share, and it is not what popular culture tells you it should be. Chapter 1. Dismantling the myth of emotional volatility. Let us begin by confronting a lie you have been told your entire life. The lie is this: that women are more emotional than men, and therefore less capable of making cold, rational decisions under pressure. This is not just wrong. It is a strategic weapon used to keep women out of rooms where power is exercised and wealth is created. Let me give you the data. A landmark study from the University of California tracked the investment decisions of over 35,000 individual investors over a 7-year period. The result? Women outperformed men by an average of 1.4 percentage points per year. Not because they were luckier, because they were less reactive. They made fewer trades. They resisted the emotional pull of market panic. They applied disciplined, evidence-based logic. While their male counterparts were letting fear and ego drive the wheel, emotional volatility is not a female trait. It is a human trait. But here is what the data shows us. Women who reach the highest levels of financial achievement have learned, through discipline, through failure, and through relentless self-examination, to master that volatility, to transform it into signal rather than noise. The women we will study in this audiobook do not suppress emotion, they decode it. They use emotional data as an input to their logic engine, not as the engine itself. This is a crucial distinction. Think of it this way. A master chess player does not ignore the pressure of a ticking clock. She registers it, quantifies it, accounts for it in her strategy, and then moves with precision. The clock does not move her pieces. She does. This is what debiased logic looks like in practice. Chapter 2. The architecture of debiased thinking. Every human mind runs on cognitive shortcuts, called heuristics. These shortcuts are useful. They help us navigate a world drowning in information. But they are also dangerous, because shortcuts cut corners, and corners, in high-stakes decisions, are where fortunes are lost. The women at the top of the financial pyramid have developed an almost obsessive relationship with their own cognitive biases. They study them, they map them, they build systems to protect themselves from them. Let us walk through the most critical biases that the high-net-worth women I have studied has specifically trained themselves to neutralize. The first is confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out information that confirms what we already believe. This is perhaps the most destructive bias in high-stakes decision-making. When you want a deal to work, your brain will hunt for evidence that it will. It will quietly bury the red flags. The elite female decision-maker has a countermeasure for this. She builds what I call a descent protocol into every major decision process. Before any significant move is made, she deliberately assembles the strongest possible case against her own position. She assigns someone, sometimes herself, sometimes a trusted advisor, to play the role of strategic enemy, to tear apart the plan, to find every flaw, to argue for failure. This is not pessimism, this is inoculation. Chapter 2 continued. More cognitive biases. And the second mental weapon. The second bias that elite women actively counter is the sunk cost fallacy. This is the psychological trap that keeps people pouring resources into failing endeavors because of what has already been invested. I have put 3 years into this company. I cannot walk away now. That sentence, that single sentence, has destroyed more wealth than almost any market crash. High net worth women are ruthless about sunk costs because they understand a fundamental truth. Past investment is information, but it is not instruction. The only question that matters in any given moment is, given what I know right now, is forward movement justified? Not, how much have I already spent? Not, how will this look to others? Only, does the logic support continuing? This requires a particular kind of courage that is often mistaken for coldness. It is not coldness, it is clarity. And clarity at scale is worth millions. The third bias is the status quo bias, the powerful gravitational pull toward keeping things as they are. Change carries perceived risk. Staying still feels safe. But staying still in a dynamic market is not safety. It is slow erosion. The women who build real, lasting wealth have trained themselves to treat inaction as a choice with consequences, not as a neutral default. Chapter 3. Strategic detachment, the psychological pivot. Now we move into one of the most misunderstood skills in high-stakes decision-making. I call it strategic detachment. And I want to be very precise about what it is and what it is not. Strategic detachment is not emotional numbness. It is not the absence of care. The women I have studied care deeply about their teams, their missions, their legacies. They feel the weight of their decisions, but they have developed the capacity to step outside of that feeling, temporarily, to evaluate a situation from a position of clarity rather than reactivity. Think of it as the difference between being inside a storm and observing a storm from a weather satellite. Both experiences are real, but only one gives you the data you need to navigate. Here is how the psychological pivot works in practice. When a high-stakes situation presents itself, a hostile acquisition offer, a key executive departure, a sudden market shift, the first instinct for most people is to react. To respond emotionally, immediately, from a place of threat or fear or excitement. The high net worth woman has trained herself to insert a pause, not a long pause, sometimes just 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, she executes a mental pivot. She steps outside of herself and asks, if I had no personal stake in this outcome, what would I observe? What would the data tell me? What does the pattern of history suggest? This pivot is not natural. It is trained. It is a learned cognitive reflex that is built through thousands of small iterations, through journaling decisions and their outcomes, through deliberate postmortems, through the cultivation of trusted advisors who will tell you the truth when you are in the grip of bias. Let me share a framework I call the 3 lenses. Every high-stakes decision should be evaluated through 3 distinct lenses before action is taken. The first lens is the data lens. Strip away emotion and look only at what is measurable and verifiable: numbers, timelines, patterns. What has happened before in comparable circumstances? What does the evidence actually say? Independent of what you hope or fear. The second lens is the systems lens. How does this decision ripple through the broader structure? Who is affected downstream? What dependencies are disrupted? What second and third order consequences are most likely? Most people see only the immediate effect of a decision. Elite decision makers see 3 moves ahead. The third lens is the values lens. Not the emotional reaction, but the principled position. Does this action align with the core mission? Does it honor the commitments that define the enterprise? Is it consistent with the long-term vision, even if it is uncomfortable in the short term? Chapter 4. Wealth Generating Engine in Internal Discipline at Scale. There is a concept in engineering called a flywheel. A flywheel is a heavy rotating disc. It stores kinetic energy. It takes enormous effort to get it spinning. But once it reaches speed, it sustains momentum with very little additional input. The internal discipline of the high net worth woman is a cognitive flywheel. Each device decision she makes adds rotational energy to the wheel. Each time she exercises the psychological pivot, each time she applies the 3 lenses, each time she resists the sunk cost trap or the status quo pull, she adds momentum, and over time, that discipline compounds, not just financially, but cognitively. The mind that is trained to make excellent decisions under pressure becomes more capable of making excellent decisions under pressure. The muscle grows. This is what I mean when I say we can transform internal discipline into a scalable, wealth-generating engine of influence. It is not a metaphor. It is a mechanism, and like all mechanisms, it can be built, maintained, and optimized. Let me show you how it works in 4 stages. Stage 1 is awareness. Before you can devise your decisions, you must become aware of your biases. This means establishing a decision journal, a simple, consistent practice of recording significant decisions as you make them, noting the reasoning behind them, and returning to review the outcomes. Not to judge yourself, but to study yourself. You are building a personal data set. Over time, patterns will emerge. You will begin to see where your thinking is reliable and where it is systematically distorted. Stage 2 is architecture. Once you know your biases, you build systems to counteract them. For confirmation bias, you build a descent protocol. For sunk cost thinking, you build a forward logic checkpoint. A question you ask before every continuation. Does the current evidence justify moving forward? Not does the past investment justify it. Does the current evidence? For status quo bias, you build an activation trigger, a regular review cycle where you deliberately ask, if we were starting fresh today, would we make this same choice? Stage 3 is practice. This is where most people fail. They understand the concept, they'll build the system, and then they do not practice. The psychological pivot, the 3 lenses, the descent protocol. None of these are effective as theory. They are only effective as trained reflexes, and trained reflexes require repetition. This means applying the frameworks to small, low-stakes decisions as a training ground. It means seeking out situations of manageable pressure to practice emotional regulation. It means building the skill when the cost of error is low, so that when the cost of error is catastrophic, the reflex is already there. Stage 4 is scale. This is where internal discipline transforms into influence. When a leader makes consistently excellent decisions, trust compounds. Her team learns to rely on her clarity, Her investors gain confidence in her judgment. Her market reputation becomes a compounding asset. The individual cognitive discipline becomes an organizational culture. Other people start to operate by the same standards, not because they are mandated to, but because they are drawn to the quality of thinking that permeates the organization. This is what I mean by a wealth-generating engine of influence. The discipline does not stay inside one person's head. It radiates outward. It reshapes the environment. It creates a new standard. Chapter 5. The Language of Power. How elite women communicate high-stakes decisions. We cannot discuss decision-making without discussing communication, because a brilliant decision that is poorly communicated is a wasted decision. The world's most successful women have learned to speak the language of power, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a precision and authority that commands rooms and shifts markets. The first principle of power communication is what I call the logic architecture. When presenting a high-stakes decision or recommendation, the elite female leader never leads with conclusion. She leads with architecture. She constructs the argument in a visible, traceable way. Here is what we observed. Here is what the data says. Here is the pattern of inference that leads us to this conclusion. This is not pedantry. This is trust building. When your audience can follow your logic, they are not being asked to trust your conclusion. They are being invited to trust your process. And trust in a process is far more durable than trust in a conclusion. Chapter 5. Continued. The language of power. The second principle is what I call calibrated confidence. This is the art of expressing certainty precisely, not overstating it, not understating it, but matching the expression of confidence to the actual confidence you hold. Most people default to one of two failure modes. Either they project absolute certainty to appear strong, and when they are wrong, their credibility collapses catastrophically, or they hedge everything to avoid being wrong, and no one follows them because they never stake a position. The elite female communicator has learned to say exactly this much certainty and no more. Based on the data we have, I believe this is the right path. Here are the assumptions it depends on. If those assumptions are wrong, here is my contingency. This is not weakness. This is intellectual honesty. And intellectual honesty, at the highest levels of business and wealth, is a form of power that most people never discover. The third principle is silence as strategy. The world's most powerful women in high-stakes negotiations know the value of the pause. When an offer is made, in a boardroom, across a deal table, in the hiring conversation, the instinct of most people is to respond immediately, to fill the silence. The trained negotiator knows that silence is pressure, that the first person to speak after an offer is made is negotiating against themselves. The pause, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, is not hesitation. It is leverage. Chapter 6. The Invisible Ceiling and How to Shatter It. We have arrived at the heart of this book. The invisible ceiling is not made of glass. It is not made of discrimination alone, though discrimination is real, and its weight is not to be minimized. The invisible ceiling is made of internalized limitations, of cognitive patterns that were installed in us before we were old enough to question them, of stories about what we are allowed to want, how much we are permitted to achieve, and whether our intelligence and discipline are enough to compete at the highest levels of a game that was designed without us in mind. And here's the truth that the world's wealthiest women have discovered, not by reading it in a book, but by living it, failing forward through it, and emerging on the other side with the receipts to prove it. The invisible ceiling shatters from the inside, not because the external environment suddenly became fair, not because the world changed its expectations, but because the woman standing beneath it changed her cognitive architecture so completely, so precisely, and so systematically that the ceiling became irrelevant. She did not need the world to believe in her capacity. She had proven it to herself through thousands of de-biased decisions, through the discipline of the psychological pivot, through the compounding of internal clarity into external results. This is what mastery looks like. Not perfect decisions, not an absence of fear or doubt, but a trained, refined, scalable capacity to think clearly under pressure, to act from evidence rather than from anxiety, and to build something of real and lasting value from the raw material of her intelligence, her discipline, and her will. Let me leave you with this. You did not come to this audiobook because you needed to be told you were capable. You already knew that. You came because you wanted the precise language, a framework, the architecture, cognitive tools to translate that capability into action at scale. So here is your charge. Build your decision journal. Install your descent protocol. Practice the 3 lenses. Master the psychological pivot. Train your communication with calibrated confidence. Treat your own discipline as the most important asset on your balance sheet. Because it is tests. The invisible ceiling is real, but it has never been stronger than a trained mind. You are that trained mind. Now go build the empire. Be as chapter. Resilience as strategy. The final layer of cognitive fortress. There is one more element we must address before we close. It is the element that separates the women who build and sustain empires from the women who build empires and lose them. It is resilience, but not resilience in the popular sense of the word. When most people talk about resilience, they mean something like the ability to bounce back from adversity, to absorb a blow and keep moving. This is important, but the resilience I am describing is something far more precise and far more powerful. I call it strategic resilience, the deliberate construction of a cognitive and organizational infrastructure that is designed to withstand shocks, learn from them, and emerge with greater clarity and capability on the other side. Strategic resilience is not passive. It is not endurance. It is architecture. The high net worth woman does not simply endure failure. She extracts intelligence from it. Every setback becomes data. Every crisis becomes a case study. The failed acquisition, the lost client, the market crash, the product launch that fell apart. These are not disasters to be survived. They are laboratories, and the woman who treats her failures as laboratories accumulates a kind of practical wisdom that cannot be taught in any classroom and cannot be replicated by anyone who has not lived it. Here is how to build strategic resilience deliberately. The first element is pre-mortem analysis. Before you launch any major initiative, imagine that it has already failed. Walk through the failure scenario in detail. What went wrong? What assumptions proved false? What dependencies broke? Who let whom down? The pre-mortem is not pessimism. It is preparation. By imagining failure in advance, you identify the most dangerous vulnerabilities before they become actual crises. You build contingencies. You reinforce weak points. You assign clear ownership of critical dependencies. The second element is failure debriefing. When things do go wrong, and they will, the elite woman does not perform grief or rage or self-flagellation. She conducts a structured debrief. What happened? Why did it happen? What was within my control? What was not? What will I do differently? What do I now know that I did not know before? This debrief is completed, documented, and built into the institutional memory of the organization. The failure is not buried. It is codified. The third element is the resilience network. No empire is built alone. The women at the top of the financial world maintain what I call a resilience network, a small, trusted circle of advisors peers, and mentors who have been specifically selected for their honesty, their expertise, and their courage to tell the truth when comfort would be easier. This network is not a support group, it is a strategic asset. It is the human infrastructure that provides calibration, challenge, and course correction when the internal compass is compromised by stress or proximity to the problem. Closing. The legacy of logic. We have covered a great deal of ground in this audiobook. We have dismantled the myth of emotional volatility. We have studied the architecture of debiased thinking, the psychological pivot, the 3 lenses framework, the 4 stages of building a wealth-generating discipline engine, the language of power, and the construction of strategic resilience. But I want to close with something that goes beyond strategy, something that transcends the balance sheet. The women we have studied in this book are not simply building businesses. They are building legacies. They are demonstrating, with every decision and every outcome, that rigorous logic and deep humanity are not opposites, that clarity and compassion can coexist, that the ceiling, invisible though it may be, was never load-bearing. Every high net worth woman who masters her cognitive architecture and builds something of real value is not just creating wealth for herself. She is expanding the range of what is considered possible for every woman who comes after her. She is changing the story. She is dismantling the ceiling, not just for herself, but for the generation that is watching. This is the legacy of logic. This is what it means to master high-stakes decision-making as a woman who refuses to be contained. You have the tools. You have the framework. You have the understanding. The only question remaining is, what will you build? Thank you for listening. Now go.